Hello, this is the first in a series of introductory videos about Gaffer. Now, instead of going over the individual UI elements and talking about the specifics of these, what I will do instead is create a simple scene that you can follow along with, and then I will go into more detail about the different user interface elements as we go along. So let's first, in the graph editor, hit tab to create a new node. You can create a sphere node here, and once you have that node selected, you will see that you have a sphere primitive in the viewer, you have the parameters for the sphere in the node editor, and you will see a sphere location in the hierarchy view, which corresponds to what you see in the view. Let's also create a cube. And let's say I want to combine both of these locations. I can select both, either via shift or dragging a region, and I can create a group node. And what the group node will do is it will combine both of the input streams to a new location, or it will combine them under a new location in the hierarchy view, which is currently called group. Can change that to geo, for example, and you can see the change correspondingly in the hierarchy view as well. What you will notice is that I do not see the sphere and the cube anymore in the viewport. I will just get a bounding box representation. And the reason for this is because Gaffer by default will only expand in the viewer what you have expanded in the hierarchy view. This is mainly for performance reasons. There are ways to change exactly what is displayed in the viewer, but we will go over this in a later point. If you open up the geo group, you will see that now you have both locations available here. We can hit W to move the cube out of the way in the viewport, and now we have both of these locations next to each other. You can navigate the viewport same as in Maya and most other DCCs with Alt left mouse to tumble, middle mouse to pan, and right mouse to zoom. Now let's also create a camera to render through. And also combine this with the rest of the scene. However, I do not want to group this under a geo location as well. I want to just merge the camera next to the geo group without putting it into another location. I can do so by selecting both of these nodes and creating a merge scenes node. This will just put both locations right next to each other. So you can see I have my geo group and I have my camera. I can view through the camera by going to the viewer icon for the viewer camera icon on the top here and selecting my camera location here. And to move the camera, which is disabled by default to not accidentally change it, you can select the camera tool here on the side, and now you can move the camera to a desired position. Let's also create a light. We can use any of the Arnold lights that are available. In this case, I will just use a quad light. And I will also merge it next to everything like so. And you can see that when I select the merge scenes node, we see everything in tandem again. I can go back to perspective view and move my light. Like so. And one thing that you probably noticed by now is that by default the viewer, the node editor, and the hierarchy view are all following the node selection. So if I'm selecting any of these nodes, you will see only whatever I currently have selected in all of the other tabs here. So this is the Gaffer default, which may not be very useful. And what you can do instead is to change the focus mode. You can do so by going into the top right corner of any of these panels and, for example, use the pin mode. This will pin the currently selected node to the viewer in this case. So if I do that, you can see that it is now pinned to the merge scenes node. So no matter what else I'm selecting, my view is pinned to this node. Another alternative, which I personally prefer, is the focus node. And what this will do is, what I previously did here already, is to enable the focus on the top right corner of any node. And this will temporarily switch the focus to the node that I have selected here with the focus mode. Usually I like to keep this somewhere at the bottom of my script so that I can see the full scene in the viewport and leave the hierarchy view on the same mode so that these always go in tandem. If I go to the camera and focus that, see I only have the camera in the viewport and I only have the camera in the hierarchy view. If I go back to the merge scenes node and focus that, I have everything in the viewport and everything in the hierarchy view. The node editor is usually something where it makes sense to keep that on the current node selection, because that's usually what you want to edit. Now let's also do a shader assignment. We can do this with the shader assignment node. Connect that up and assign a Arnold standard surface. And what this is doing is it is assigning this shader to all of the inputs by default. You can confirm that by, for example, selecting the geolocation and going to the Scene Inspector tab. And let's also pin the Scene Inspector to the focus node here. And what the Scene Inspector is doing is it will basically give you an overview over all the attributes that are set on the selection, on the globals, or that are Arnold specific to the currently selected element in the hierarchy view. So this is similar to Houdini middle mouse click, for example, or the attributes tab in Katana. If you go to the Arnold section, you will see that both the sphere and the cube have a standard surface shader assigned here, which exactly maps to the name that we have assigned here. And we can go ahead and define our render settings next. We can do so by creating a standard options node. The standard option node will allow you to change the global render settings of the scene. So, for example, what I can do is I can change my camera here and left click, drag and drop that from my hierarchy view. And one thing that I want to draw attention to is this little enable button. At the moment, I'm basically enabling this parameter to be set, and I can confirm that. If I have the node editor and the scene inspector next to each other, I can slightly change my layout here by clicking this button and splitting it on the right. Drag my node editor, for example, down here. And you can see if I go to globals, under options, you will see that the render camera is set to /camera, which is the path to the camera here. If I disable this parameter is no longer set here. I can also, for example, change the resolution. Let's set that to a small HD resolution. And I can also create some R-node globals by creating an R-node options node. This allows me to set R-node specific rendering settings like AA samples, ray depth settings, subdivision globals, and so on. Next, we also need to create some outputs to view in our render. By default, scene constructed in Gaffer does not create any AOVs by default, so we have to create them by ourselves. We can do so by creating an outputs node. We can click on the little plus here, go to interactive, R-node beauty. This will create a beauty output for us. And next we need a interactive node to view our renders. We can do that by creating a CS R-node preview render. And this is a Cinesite specific node for creating renders in one go. The Gaffer default is slightly different, but this node comes with a couple of convenient features alongside it. So if I pin this node, you will see that my viewer is switching to a render view. And if I hit go, a render will start. However, at the moment, because the intensity of my light is not very high, I can barely make out shapes from my render. So what I can do is I can go back to my light and maybe change the exposure here, and now I can start seeing a render in my render view. Now you might want to switch back and forth between what you're rendering and your 3D scene. What I personally like doing is creating another viewer here. You can do so by once again clicking on the top right panel and create another viewer. Split this on the right and dragging this over. You can see now I have two viewers that are both pinned. However, I want to keep one viewer on the focus node, and the other viewer I would like to pin to my CSR node render preview. And this way I can change my focus for the 3D viewport, and I'm pinning the render view always to my render. I can, now that I switched the, that I defined the render camera in the standard options node, I can also switch from a preset menu here to the render camera, which will take the camera that is currently set in the render settings of the active stream. And I can, for example, also tumble the camera around. So now that we created a simple scene, we can start going into more detail about the individual elements that make up Gaffer next. Hello. Let's have a look at how you can manage your assignments in Gaffer. To continue off where we left off in the last session, we can load the wiki demo 01 from the shared notes. And this, if you remember, has our scene with a couple of cubes and the sphere inside. Now, what we currently have is we have our input scene and a shader assignment that applies this standard surface to the whole input scene. So if we were to change anything here, you can see that this shader is applied to everything at the moment. Now, in a production context, oftentimes this is not what you want, because you oftentimes have your scene assembled at the top, and you might want to do specific overrides only to parts of the hierarchy downstream. Now, let's say we want to make the shader assignment, for example, only work on the sphere. What we can do is we can select the sphere either in the hierarchy view or in the viewer, and drag and drop it from either of those windows onto the shader assignment. And what this will do is it will create a path filter here. Now, the path filter, you can see, stores the path that we just dropped onto the shader assignment, and you can see now that it is filtered with our selection. What we can do is we can do the same thing for the cube. Let's say do another standard surface here, and this time I will make it yellow instead. And we can select our cubes and drag and drop them onto the second shader assignment, and you can see now we have one shader assignment that is filtered with the cubes and one shader assignment that is filtered for the sphere. Now we can modify what we have inside here by either adding a new input field and typing in something manually. We can also delete it, but on top of that, we can modify it, the filters, without having the node editor open even. So one thing that you can do is you can drag and drop a path onto a filter, and that will just replace it with whatever you drop onto here. You can also hold down Control while dragging it on here, and this will remove the selected location from the list of paths. You can also hold down Shift while dragging it onto here, and it will add to the list of paths. Now, what you can see here is that we have the list of all the cubes in the scene, and the problem is that in a production scenario, the number of cubes might change at a later point. You might get some more added, and if you only have absolute paths here, those will not update dynamically. So a better solution is to make use of wildcards instead. I'm just going to delete all of them. And what I can do here is I can make use of a couple of sets of wildcards that you might know from Linux, for example, and they are specifically the question mark, which matches any single character. So in this case we're saying match anything that starts with geo, followed by cube, and then a single character afterwards. What this will do is it will assign this path filter to the 3 cubes here, namely cube 1, 2, and 3. It will not assign it to cube 50 because cube 50 has 2 digits behind it. If you want to assign it to anything that starts with cubes and any number of characters behind it, you can assign it to cube star. And this will basically match, in this case, also with cube 50. If you want to also include subgroups, what you can do is you can make use of recursive assignments, because at the moment this only assigns the shader to any immediate children of geo. However, there might be multiple subgroups in complex hierarchies that you want to assign stuff to, and this you can accomplish by adding 3 dots in between a search pattern, and the 3 dots will basically recursively traverse the hierarchy for anything that is under geo in any amount of subgroups as long as the final child and starts with the name cube. And you can see that this now matches all of the cube locations. Now here it is obvious to see what we actually assigned our shader to, because we can see it update in the viewer. However, oftentimes a render might be either too expensive, or you just might want to check specifically what an assignation is actually matching to if you have a more complex expression. And this you can do by right-clicking on the filter and select affected objects. And this will select all the matches that this specific filter that you have selected outputs. Now let's say we also want to do further modifications to our cube. So let's say we want to add an Arnold attributes node, which allows us to override object properties. So we can add that to the same path filter here. And we can, for example, set our subdivision iterations. At the moment you can see nothing is happening, and that is because the cubes are of type polymesh, and for Arnold to be able to subdivide them, we need to change their mesh type to subdivision surface. Now you can see the cubes are being subdivided here as well. Now, while this is a valid approach, oftentimes in a production scenario you might have these nodes scattered across multiple different box nodes and in different places of scene. And copying and pasting the path filter is not usually a good approach, because if at any point you need to update the path filter, you have to update them all. Instead, what you can do is store this specific set of cubes in what is called a set. And a set, for example, is very similar to collections inside of Katana. So what we can do is we can create a set node here, and we can add that same path filter. And in the set node, we can change the mode. In this case, we leave it at create, and we can give it a name, for example, cubes. And in the shader assignment, attributes and mesh type node, we can now call the set with a set filter node. You can assign that here. And you can get all of the available sets at this point in the graph by right-clicking on the set expression and selecting the set that you would like to choose. And now we can see that we have the cubes assigned here. And if I was to change the actual set upstream, for example, let's say I wanted to go back to only immediate children, you can see that the set filter is then live querying the change of the set that we did upstream and is updating all the assignments here. Now what you can also do is you can modify an existing set. So in this case we create a set called cubes, and let's say we at a later point want to modify this set. We can, for example, add location downstream. So we can once again include the subgroup here and add it to the cube set at a later point. Likewise, we can also remove elements from an existing set, or we can override the current set if it already exists. Now let's say we want to, for example, combine different filters or combine different sets. What we can do in this case, for example, let's create two sets, one with the immediate children of cubes. Let's call the set, for example, top cubes. And let's also create another set where we go one level deeper. For all the cubes that might be at a in-between hierarchy location. And let's call this subcubes, for example. So our top cubes are these four, and our subcubes is the one on the bottom left. Now what I can do in my set filter, at the moment the set expression is not valid anymore because I have no set that is called cubes. I just have a set that's called top cubes and subgroups. If I want to assign it to all of the sets that end with cubes, I can use wildcards again. So this will match both top cubes and subcubes. I can also combine two different sets by just calling them individually. So I can assign this to top cubes, and I can then either go with a space or a pipe and add my subcube set. You can see that now this will assign it to both of them. And what you can also do is if you go hover over here, you can see that you have multiple options of doing, for example, an intersection or a difference. And to show how we can do this, we can also maybe go a little bit more into detail about the filters that we have here. If we want to combine two different filters, we can do so with a filter combiner. We can add both filters here, so to speak, merge them together. At the moment they are going to be unioned together, which means that it's just going to add up everything that is contained in both of these filters. And let's create a new set out of this and call it all cubes, for example. If I now have three different sets, all cubes basically now contains all of the cubes, and I still have my other two sets which just contains the subcubes and the top cubes. In the set filter I can combine them in different ways. So for example, I can do all cubes minus subcubes, which in this case will give me a difference between all of the cubes that I have in the scene and subtracting the one in the subgroup here. And alternatively, I could, for example, also do an intersection. So, for example, all the valid paths that are in both all cubes and in subcubes, which in this case is only going to be the cube that is contained in the subgroup here. Now, regarding what is contained inside sets, you can find that out in the scene inspector. If you go to the scene inspector under globals, you will find all of the sets in the scene, depending on where you pinned your scene inspector. And in this case, we can see that Gaffer creates a couple of default sets for cameras and for lights. However, you can see that we also have our 3 different cube sets. And you can see next of them you have a number, and the number specifies the amount of children that this particular set has. So if I click on it, it will select all of the children contained within the particular set here. Alternatively, I can also create a new panel with the set editor. And the set editor is a bit of a nicer way to inspect all of the sets that you have in your scene. You can also see the members here, and you have them grouped in different hierarchy levels here, which can be quite useful in a production scenario where you might have a lot of different sets. If I had a prefix here separated with a colon, you can see that it will then automatically put this in a kind of a sub-hierarchy level style, which might be a little bit easier to search. And on top of that, you can also filter here for different sets, which might be a little bit easier to use than the sets in the globals of the scene inspector. You can also see what your current selection, what sets your current selection is contained in. If you select an object in the hierarchy, go to selection, under set membership, you will see all of the sets that this particular object or this particular selection is included in. So you can see that cube 1 is contained in top cubes and inside all cubes. Let's have a look at the viewer in Gaffer in a bit more detail. You can load from the shared nodes the wiki demo 02. Launch render. First of all, let's collapse everything here, and I'm gonna go over most of the important settings in the viewports, both in 3D and in 2D. First of all, we can start on the top here with the expansion modes. It's relatively straightforward. You can select any location in the hierarchy view and use down arrow and up arrow to expand. You can also recursively expand all child locations by via shift and down arrow. You also have the option to expand all, and what this will do is it will show you everything that you have in the scene, even if you have your whole hierarchy view collapsed. This can be quite useful if you don't want to clutter your hierarchy view. However, keep in mind that this comes at a performance cost, and in heavy scenes it might be a bit too heavy to use. Second part here is selection masks. So you can, for example, change this to only have lights as a valid selection. Can be useful in lighting context, for example. Also have drawing modes, which are relatively self-explanatory. In this case, we can go, for example, for wireframe on shaded. What's a bit more interesting are those location-specific overrides. We can change how you want to display lights and their visualizer scales, and you can change the visualizers in the whole scene in general as well. A common option that you might want to use is change the scale. Visualizers are basically anything in your scene that is not renderable but is just a viewport representation to help you work. For example, the direction that this quad light is shining, or the camera frustum on the camera here. You can change those visualizers scale in scenes where, for example, you might have a very big scene scale of a big environment. You can change those to make it a bit easier to see those contents of your scene. And you can also, for example, change the camera frustum to only be displayed when it is selected, or you can have it on all the time. As for the shading modes, most of them are pretty straightforward. However, what is very interesting is these diagnostic modes. Let's say, for example, that I had an under attributes and I disable the camera visibility of the spheres. I can have a diagnostic preview of that in the viewport. If I enable camera visibility here, you can change, as you can see that because I changed the camera visibility on the sphere to be off, it's displaying it to me in black. Anything that doesn't have a local override will display as a default, and if I was to enable it, the override here, you can see that it turns white. This can be quite useful in a variety of different situations where you might want to quickly check what is actually visible in your scene without having to render it. And there's quite a few more options available here as well. Now, you also have some camera options to switch between different cameras. If you have a render camera set, you can use this render camera preset here to switch to it, or you can manually choose a camera or a light to look through, or browse to a custom location. If you are in the perspective view, you can go to settings here, and you can change things like the field of view for the perspective camera, as well as the clipping planes. Also, last but not least, have some settings for the gadgets here. So you can disable and enable the grid. You also have this inspector. And what the inspector is it's basically giving you some options for selections that have a shader assigned. You can override it directly here in the viewport. If you double click on any of the values, you will see that I can change the quad light exposure under exactly this path here, which will be important in a multi-shot scenario. For example, you always want to make sure that you are overriding it at the right spot, but this can be useful if you don't want to look through all of the nodes in your scene, but just want to quickly do some overrides and working only in the viewer. You can do that here. Likewise, if I have a location selected that has a surface shader assigned, you can change that here as well. On the side here, you do have preset modes for, selection, moving, rotation, and scale. Same as in Maya, for example. If you were to change to a camera, by default it is locked from moving the view. You can enable this camera tool here to enable the editing of the camera that you're currently looking through. Also have a crop window, which I'll go over in the 2D view in a second as well. And as for edit scopes, we will go over them in a different section, because this is more related to lighting and the multi-shot workflow. Over here on the side in the 2D view, we do have options for comparison mode, for example. This is useful if you have multiple images. So let's say I'm going to change the color of the cubes here. I basically have my current render, and I can switch back to a previous render that I saved. If I want to compare both of them, I can set my comparison number here. So I can left click to set this to be the first index, and right click on any other one and select it to be a different one. I can then start toggling the comparison mode. So I can set this, for example, to replace, and now I can basically toggle between the two. This automatically goes between 1 and 2 as a default that you can compare to. If you alternatively wanted to imitate the switch mode in Katana's catalog, you can set this, for example, to under, and then hit Q to toggle between the two. You can also see that you have a value read at the bottom here, which is basically the values under your cursor in RGB, HSV, and an exposure. You can also control drag to open up a region and move it after the fact and read the values from that region. You can, instead of just having one region, you can also create multiple ones and compare all of the values at a glance. If you want to delete any of them, you can either use the X on the top right here or the X on the bottom here. You also have an AOV reader on the top here. You can go up and down the list with page up and page down. Switching between diffuse, specular, and RGBA here. You can toggle between the different color channels via RGBA, and you have some options to enable and display highlight clipping here, as well as basic exposure and gamma controls. You can reset them by clicking on the corresponding icon. And last but not least, you also have an option to change your LUT. If you have diagnostic utility outputs, for example, you might want to switch this to none if you're viewing them. And last but not least, you also have the option to pause the viewer. This will, even if you change any of the settings for shaders, for example, this will pause viewer updates until you force a refresh. You can also see this in the 3D view. If you pause it here, you can see that if I was to disconnect my entire scene here, for example, that my 3D view doesn't update until I toggle a refresh. This can be useful if you have very heavy scenes that you might not continuously want to update, but only update them on demand. Right, and the last thing that's worth mentioning is the crop window tool in the 2D viewer. So you can activate it by simply clicking the button on the left. Shortcut for this is C, and this will give you a region here. If you just left click and drag in the viewer, you will only move and translate the region around. It will clip to the borders here, but you can basically move it around like this. You can also create a new region by dragging outside of it. However, sometimes you want to create a completely new region while still being inside of an existing crop region. In those cases, you can hold down Shift and drag, and this will create a new region freely from wherever you started. Notice that toggling the visibility by hitting C will literally only do that. It will not disable the crop region. To disable the crop region, you can tick off this enabled here and then toggle the visibility here. And to completely reset it, you can hit the reset button, which will reset it to its default.